Thank you very much, Professor Meyers. I just want to ask a very sort of odd question, but maybe you'll want to answer it later on. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if that Bedouin hadn't stumbled on that cave, because it seems from all the accounts, including yours, that the Essenes were essentially a fairly small community, that in fact there may have probably been other communities, maybe with somewhat less literature, that was spread all over the place, but it so happens that the climate near the Dead Sea managed to preserve the documents that you are now studying. And as you know better than most of us, I suppose, the Jewish people in the 1st century AD multiplied by a very high proportion. I mean, there's big argument just by how much, but it's quite clear that there were at least 10% Jews amongst the citizens of the Roman Empire at the end of the 1st century, despite the destruction of the temple, and that the story about the Romans exiling the Jewish population from Palestine is not true. In the light of that, do you think that we tend maybe to overestimate the importance of the Essene community? But René Kogel wanted to ask a question.
Let me answer that first, because that's a big one. I don't think we have overemphasized the importance of the discovery. And let me first say how large the community was as best we can reconstruct it. From the archaeology of Qumran, we can more or less conclude that there were a maximum at one time, between 150 and 70, up to 1,200 souls, individuals, and at some times as few, perhaps as 300 to 500. So I would say between 5 and 1,200 is the group we're talking about at the Dead Sea. But that was the esprit, that was the leadership core, that was the training kibbutz, if you will, of the rest of the Qumrans, a community who lived in the cities of Palestine, especially in Jerusalem. And we don't know their numbers, but from Josephus we know that they were not insignificant. They were in the many thousands, 4, 5, 10,000, something like that, in Jerusalem alone. So they were a kind of an extremist group propounding the truths of their sectarian literature. But in any case, it's a small group. What the corpus of sectarian literature does, aside from what I concluded with about what it tells us about the nature of the Hebrew Bible, which is important enough, it gives us a glimpse into Judaism as or Jewish civilization, especially belletristic Jewish civilization at that time. Writing 600 of these works that are attested are not are not biblical. They are either sectarian or just other compositions from the period. Many of them predate the existence of the Qumran community. So what we have among those other 600 scrolls is a snapshot into Jewish creativity, not just sectarian creativity. I didn't bring that statistic. Maybe Bill knows. Where is Bill? Oh, there. Of the 600 other scrolls, what percentage of that is sectarian? It's probably 10 or 15%, isn't it? Something like that. I mean,
it depends what. It's a circular. To answer the question is a circular argument. Yeah. We don't know what was sectarian except what's there, and people have different proportions.
And that material, which dates to the 3rd century, like Jubilees or Enoch, BCE, and has its own unique calendar form. In any case, it shows a vitality to the Jewish literary world that I think exceeds by far anything we had imagined before. And I think this belletristic aspect of it certainly justifies all the enthusiasm, excitement, and other things that have been generated.
Since victors get to write their own history, the Maccabees, books 1 and 2, how much of that can we accept as authentic in terms of, are there other alternative sources that tell us what Maccabees 1 and 2 tell us, with all their hubris and all the rest, is what actually happened? Are there alternative sources, I guess is that.
The only other alternative source for this period is the book of Daniel, really. We don't, and things that of the Qumran corpus that we might date to this period.
Well, Josephus.
Of course, Josephus is our primary source. So we have the book of Daniel, Josephus. We have the sectarian literature that's early. One of the earliest scrolls published was the Pesher Habakkuk, and that certainly sort of began to unravel this breakup of the community into sectarian division. So I think we're in pretty good shape, and the commentaries now out on 1-2 Maccabees provide a pretty positive view about these two books. So they're not celebratory. Nobody is that celebratory towards the Hasmoneans, I don't think. So I think we're in pretty decent shape.
Derek Pensler.
Picking up on what you said at the end of your remarks when you talked about the Jewish response to Hellenization being an acceptance of certain aspects of it and a rejection of others, it's a phenomenon we know throughout the world as defensive modernization. But defensive modernization often has very unfortunate results when we look at attempts in the Islamic world, or for example in East Asia in this century, to adopt this technique. And I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which this kind of tactic can really work, or if it really leads, as so often it can lead to militarism, it can lead to chauvinism.
I think what your last sentence characterizes what it did to the Maccabees. It made them into Hellenistic dynasts who betrayed their people. On the other hand, post-Bar Kokhba, post-Great Revolt, the Hellenization process seems to create a kind of synergism, a kind of positive energy, especially in the cities like Sepphoris or Tiberias, where the appropriation of Greek language and the adoption of an urbanistic, cosmopolitan lifestyle and contact with the outside world inspires the Jewish people at Sepphoris, for example, to get on and collate what we call the Mishnah, and to engage in some of the most wonderful pictorial art that's ever been produced. So I see it as after the revolts. Now, you might say, so long as there was such radical opposition to westernization or Hellenization, whatever you want to, modernization as you call it, and you had a Haredi group, the Zealots or whatever you want to call the leaders of the first and second revolts. I mean, Rabbi Akiba, in adopting Bar Kokhba as his Messiah, was kind of a Haredi character, really.
Adopting the Lubavitcher.
Right, it would be the same. So after that period and the whole reevaluation of this ferocious stance that resulted in 2 disastrous wars, I think led to a much more healthful rapprochement with the whole idea of Hellenization.
Ada Rapoport?
2 questions for clarification, really. One, I don't know if other people here have read, as I have, and with no professional competence at all to evaluate, because I don't work in this period, in this field, Norman Golb's thesis about the whole Qumran settlement being a military fort rather than a living religious community, that all the texts were actually written, copied in Jerusalem. They were not produced by the Qumran sect. How seriously do you take it?
I think it's nonsense, and I think...
Don't get around the bush, Eric.
No, I mean, it's no sense. I think Norman's got virtually no followers left. He has one base, well, some of them here maybe. What Norman did that was very important in the discussion was to emphasize and underline to everyone's benefit that many of the scrolls uncovered in Qumran predate the Qumran sectarian settlement there, and may have come from many other places. We now know that. We know the carbon-14 analysis alone that was recently done by the Israel Antiquities Authority not only has verified the dates of paleographical dating of the scrolls, but has really justified the whole tone and interpretive stance of scholars for the last 30 years.
But as a professional archaeologist, you're not at all swayed by his arguments about the layout of the site.
No. Nor are there's one other group that has tried to do that. They are Belgians from Louvain University, a husband and wife team, that has argued that this is an Hellenistic outpost of a very wealthy Jewish family that could not put up more or less with what was going on elsewhere. Well, they don't even say that, but they're very wealthy Hellenistic family, and not only have they been roundly disputed, I think successfully, but they have now pulled out of the game. They're not even going to publish their results any longer because the debate has been so harsh that they have recently quit.
Withdrawn.
Yeah, withdrawn.
My other, if I may still, my other half of question is something that Bill touched on and concerns me a great deal because of my own work, but again, with a perfect awareness of it, that these are different periods. But how do you really know to identify sectarianism from any kind of notion of mainline? I mean, is your only yardstick the degree to which the material conforms with what we eventually call rabbinic Judaism? I know, for example, that Miktzat Maseh HaTorah, that the one kind of halachic document appears to reflect a much stricter, more literalist kind of halakha than the rabbinic interpretation of it, and could, from the perspective of the rabbis, hundreds of years later, be viewed as sectarian. But do we know who did what, how many? I mean, is it the numerical, statistical yardstick, or a...
I think the sectarian documents such as the Pesharim, the Serika Yachad, the Manual of Discipline, those scrolls which espouse a uniquely celibate, monastic, if you want to call it that, way of life that is at such radical variance from that which we know about other groups within Judaism. Really distinct. Well, I don't know. We have in Philo perhaps a reference to this, the Therapeutai, but really these are anomalies within the norm of Judaism. It's a small group, as I told Yehuda. I mean, we're not talking about...
Starting point is to challenge the notion of anomaly at a much later stage, where I really don't believe that things that we have come to believe from the 19th century on are anomalous, actually were anomalous. I think 19th century bourgeois, sober, rational, liberal historians have felt more comfortable regarding these things as anomalous. I mean, anyone like me who works in any field remotely connected with Kabbalah, for example, would naturally feel that. And I feel that about a hell of a lot more. So I'm wondering whether for this period you have anything better than what a whole tradition of historiography has taught you to feel to be sectarian.
Could I put in a word on that? I think, if I'm hearing correctly, you're using the word sect in different ways as part of, I think, what's going on. By sect, Ada, do you mean something deviant from a standard?
Yes.
Whereas the way I always use the term, everybody is a sect. You know, everyone's in some party. I don't know. You can speak for yourself.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes.
Really?
So I think that's. But I mean, the whole notion that the time in which they were living was the end of time, which evoked such drastic ways of understanding purity, even way to the right of some of the Chaverim in the early Pharisaic movement. We don't really know of other groups that they wouldn't defecate or make pee-pee, to use the word again, in the camp. They had to go out. They had to bury their excrement so that it would not permeate the air above. And we have very specialized texts. They had very specialized views about death and about spilling fluids and all of this. Secondary contamination through fluid touch is the most pointed notion of ritual impurity that we have in any ancient literature. So
yeah. Well, also, you know, we keep asking today, what if we didn't have some piece of information we do possess? Okay, if we didn't have Philo and Josephus and the picture they paint of the sectarian in our sense, namely divided into parties, structure of Jewish society at that time, yeah, we might have said this is just Roman period Judaism, and we didn't know how that it had all these things in it. But when you map it, it maps sufficiently closely against Philo and Josephus that it's hard not to see here a, radical sort of implies a norm again, but an unusual sect with very strongly held convictions that differed from other people with equally strongly held convictions.
Yeah, I mean, these are guys like, you know, one of the cultists of Jonestown, or, you know, the guys flying out. I mean, they lived in a world that had really no close parallels to anything that we know from ancient literature.
Jacob?
You implied that that the Maccabees, once they were Hellenized, in a way betrayed Judaism, and only later did the Hellenism find some kind of a way of coexistence with Judaism. What about Alexandria? What about Philo? I mean, what about the whole world that preceded the Maccabees, the need for the translation into Greek? I mean, they lived a very Jewish life and a very modern Western life as we do. And there was no betrayal there.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's where I began, with a successful mixing of Jewish assimilation, acculturation in Egypt that produced the Septuagint. So I agree with that. When the Maccabees took assimilation, acculturation, and used it in the enhancement of their own dynastic and financial self-interest, then it exploded in their faces, and the repercussions were enormous. And I feel that way, frankly, about some of the things happening in Israel now and in recently. When religious self-interest and dynastic self-interest supersedes the interest in the public good, somebody's going to get hurt, and you're going to get a lot of Haredi reactions to public events.
Steve? I mean, I think your understanding and my understanding of the public good in that context is quite similar. I'm not sure that there's an objective understanding of the public good, if only there were.
For sure.
I have a more modest question. I was really intrigued by your reference, Carol tells me the text is in Genesis Apocrypha, to an apparently celibate group fantasizing with some actually rather vivid literature that I wasn't familiar with about Sarah. And is that the reference to Genesis Apocrypha? Could you talk a bit more about that? I mean, I'm not. You know, you ought to.
Just because they were celibate doesn't mean they weren't horny.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's all. For the, do you want to share more, Eric?
I think it shows, in addition to my prior comment, it also shows a great flexibility in the midrashic style. I mean, what we have preserved in the canonized rabbinic corpus is only, you know, a tip of the iceberg. What we have between midrash and targum, interpretation and paraphrase or general translation, is so vast in the Qumran literature that these anomalies in the biblical text that struck them, namely Abraham panning off Sarah as his sister to save his own skin, on the one hand, it also offended them, but it also led them to think about the beauty of Sarah and to expatiate on that. So they felt in this period that it was fair game to expatiate on her physical beauty, and we don't have that in any other canonical literature that I know of. Bill? Yeah.
Well, not.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, sure, Shireen.
Not
But you know, there were, of course, women at Qumran. It's not clear how celibate they were. But on the other hand, the literature was probably written by the men.
Yep.
Anyone else?
One of the issues that you touched on, which I think is very important, which I wish you would expand on, obviously the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans were nationalists. But simultaneously, the Jewish people, and Yehuda alluded to that, turned into a missionizing religion. And the two agendas are not necessarily compatible. That is, the Maccabees circumcising the people in the territory they conquer is consistent with nationalism. But the idea of diaspora missionizing is something different. Would you somehow discuss that transition? I think that would be important for us to hear.
I'm not sure the old consensus still exists. Maybe Ari could help me with this. I think it was previously thought that Jews, in a non-military way, actively engaged in proselytism towards Gentiles from sometime in the time of Hillel, after, and beyond, till about the 3rd century. I have not really followed the debate that closely, but I know enough to know that some of my colleagues have told me that the date for this missionizing activity in a peaceful way has been moved up into the rabbinic period and did not exist in the Second Temple period as previously thought. I know Bernard Bamberger's famous book on this would place it at the end of the Second Temple. Most people have moved that up at least 150 years, if not 200 years, into the late Tannaitic period, which is one way of explaining the great expansion of numbers in Jewish population, especially in the Greek-speaking diaspora in places like Anatolia and Turkey and the
islands.
The Aegean world, yes.
Can I ask a clarification? Earlier, Yehuda alluded to the Jewish population of the Roman Empire as being in the neighborhood of 10%.
You want to know how many people that is?
No. Oh. I want to know how Topsy grew so much if it were restricted to Palestine.
No, of course not.
Not restricted. No, we're talking about the diaspora. Salah Baron suggested there were as many as 7 million Jews at this time. I heard a paper in Dublin on a conference of Roman period Judaism presented by a very distinguished demographer in Roman history, and he's more inclined to think it was between 1.2 and 1.6 million, and he gave some very elaborate arguments for that. So it's probably below 2 million and nowhere near 7 million. There's a lot of stuff in Baron that really should be ignored, and I think that demographic estimates is certainly chief among them.
Are you sure, Eric? I don't remember the number. You know, he started his social and religious history with that work on demography, and then it expanded and expanded, expanded. But I don't. That's a number that he cites, 7 million. It's extraordinary.
That's including Yirei Adonai.
Yes, of course.
I think one of the questions that certainly is of great interest to Jews who regard themselves as liberal beyond the Orthodox, of course, is the Orthodox contention that Hellenization was bad for the Jewish people. And that's expressed certainly in the propaganda that surrounds the Hanukkah story today. You can buy it in little books. The Greeks were terrible. The Greeks were our enemy. They were out to destroy us, but there were these faithful, pious people who ultimately rescued Jewish identity. So the downfall of the Maccabees is viewed as just punishment of wicked people, and it is the Pharisees and the rabbinic Jews who ultimately rescue Judaism. So I have a question, which is, do you think that if the Maccabees had not fallen, if Hellenistic Judaism in some way had survived in a very significant and powerful way, if the Pharisaic establishment had not replaced them, that the Jewish people would have continued?
Certainly the Maccabean War was a bottom line. Had the Maccabees not achieved their military success, there would have been a disappearance or an end to certain Jewish civilization as we know it. And so I agree with that. On the other hand, the irony is as I described it. And I hope I didn't leave the impression that Hellenization was rejected uniformly.